Thanks very much for that warm and kind introduction, Craig. It's great to be back in Seattle. I had the pleasure of being invited in May to go deliver grand rounds at Ben and Doug's request, and I think I have the great fortune of being the only person to be in Seattle and invited to Seattle 2 times for 2 days and had absolutely perfect weather. It seems to be a consistent joke in this conference about the weather in Seattle, but I only have favorable impressions. So please invite me back whenever you'd like to. I'm going to try to be a little bit provocative. I come from the East Coast, and you know the style over there. I wasn't raised in the East Coast, but I've learned to become more aggressive and provocative as I've spent 4 years there, because everyone around me is that way. And so I'm going to try my best to be a little bit provocative. Maureen and Manish are gentle, kind, and are trying to coax you along, and in some ways I suspect we're preaching to the choir, since you all chose to stay here rather than enjoy the morning out in Seattle. You are a select group, even though the burden of neonatal mortality, as Manish said, is many-fold times greater. The fact that as many of you stayed as you did is a good sign, I would say. It's actually encouraging rather than leaving, since we've moved outside of the context of the US a little bit. And I just lost my computer. But let me, sorry, I'm just waiting for my notes are on my computer, so that's the challenge. And I'm not nearly as sophisticated as John, who can just throw away his talk and speak off the cuff. Maybe when I'm as old and gray as John is, I can do that. Is he here? Ah, good, he's here. Good. I just wanted to have that on record that I call John old and gray, and that I aspire to be as good as him when I was. I do have gray hair, if you didn't notice. Okay, I have a short amount of time. So, one question that I think we can ask is, an alternative title to this is what should be the demands of justice, an idea of justice upon all of us? Justice is something we throw around all the time in the world of bioethics, and I'm not sure we have an adequate answer to that question. And the other way I want to think about the problem is it the case that our moral and ethical stances lead to the kind of social and structural, professional, institutional, industrial, economic, legal, regulatory commitments that we take for granted in our country and other parts of the developed world? Or is it the other way around? And this is, again, touching on what John said about how our morals evolve, how our ethical ideas evolve. There we go. So this is a map of global neonatal mortality. Manish showed a similar picture. You can see that the burden is obviously highly concentrated in a few countries. And what I want to do with a couple slides is just remind you what we take for granted in this country. Advanced neonatal care is labor-intensive, one-to-one, often 24-hour skilled nursing care. It's resource intensive. We have the latest technologies, medications. There's multiple disciplinary teams. It's time intensive. It takes months of care. We have a remarkable, again, taken for granted sense of parental commitment. This is a quote. These are pictures of a survivor of fetal surgery. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. It's a picture of the surgery. This is advertised at UCSF in San Francisco. These pictures were on the streets of San Francisco a few years ago when we were promoting it. I'm not sure I'm proud of that fact, but I was there when it was happening. I know she may not survive, the mother said a few days before her operation. I know when she grows up she may not be able to run and jump as much as other kids, but I just want to give her the best chance I can. We have professional and institutional commitments. John Clements is a professor at UCSF. He was integral in discovering surfactant. Surfactant has created is an industry now, and there's several surfactants. We spend so much of our time and our effort on developing new surfactant technologies and testing the differences between a little bit of a difference in the phospholipid concentration or the protein concentration to see if we get a marginal benefit in its production and its efficacy at the bedside. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on this, and the gain, arguably, is not so great when you put it in context relative to what we're talking about today. Costs, we have huge economic commitments, even though they end up being, as Annie said, a small proportion of all of our costs. If you look at the numbers there, this is from 2001, $12 billion spent in that year on newborn care, about $6 billion of it on preterm and low birth weight, about $1.5 billion or $1.2 billion on uncomplicated newborns, and another $5 billion for all others. So we have our share of commitments, and let's turn now to that as a backdrop. Let's turn back to what Manish introduced as the situation elsewhere. 3 to 4 million neonatal deaths. Just putting that in perspective and in terms of agenda setting, HIV/AIDS, which gets the lion's share, as you all know, of funding and press, causes about 2.5 million deaths a year nowadays, and it's reducing, largely because of all of the efforts that have been done. TB, about 1.6 million. Malaria, 1.2 million. So neonatal causes are by far the biggest thing on the horizon in terms of preventable deaths. Maureen mentioned Paul Farmer. He happens to be my department chair, and I've learned a lot from him. He's a controversial guy, but he's also a lovely person and a thought-provoking person. And I'm just going to share a quote from an article he and some other colleagues of mine put out there. And this, again, is to just try to frame it again in the sense of what we take for granted, what we assume are our sort of baseline background conditions, and then juxtaposing that with the rest of the world. Structural violence is often embedded in long-standing, ubiquitous social structures normalized by stable institutions and regular experience because they seem so ordinary in our way of understanding the world. They appear almost invisible. That's what we take for granted here. Disparate access to resources, political power, education, healthcare, and legal standing are just a few examples. The idea of structural violence is linked very closely to social injustice and the social machinery of oppression. And that's where I think the hard conversations have to happen. I think his challenge is, and Maureen said this, there is the reality of poverty, but we're talking about ethics, we're talking about morality today. How much of an ethical and moral excuse does the reality of poverty afford us in not addressing these problems globally? Shouldn't we be worried about the expressivist effects of our activities? There is the reality of resources. It's deniable, it's undeniable. But it's one thing to acknowledge it and another to assume that the resources have to stay scarce. We are arguably not doing nearly enough to rectify steep gradients of inequity for reasons that have less to do with ethics, I would argue, and more to do with the command market economics has on our collective politics. I'm just going to say that I'm on the left end of the world. That's my conflict of interest acknowledgement. One of Paul Farmer's messages is that there is a risk in starting with assumptions that might reinforce social and structural injustices rather than fundamentally seeking to alleviate them. I take him to be asking the following kind of question: how do we, really, can we reconcile universalist ideals regarding justice and access to health care with an easy temptation to assume that there's little we can do immediately to change the living conditions of the worst off in developing countries? So now I'm going to spend the last few minutes talking about India, where Manish nicely showed that that's the lion's share of disease burden for babies. 26 million babies born in India annually. It's a big number. 20% of global births. 1 million die in the neonatal period every year. The new neonatal mortality rates varies between 60, greater than 60 to less than 10. And again, this speaks to Maureen's point about women's empowerment. So the places where it's less than 10, it's one state. Anybody know it? Thank you. And why is that? Well, it's a complicated reason. I'm going to say that it's a lot of things, but interestingly enough, again, a little politics. It was, and still is, a very left-leaning communist socialist political background there. But another thing is that women are over 90% literate in that state. They're incredibly empowered to take care of themselves and their children. What was the answer? Kerala, sorry. South. Rural populations particularly have much higher neonatal mortality rates. Manish showed this slide. I'm not going to repeat it. So what are the barriers? We talked about social and structural determinants or commitments in our country. What are the barriers to neonatal survival in India? Money, access to adequate services, understanding. Here's a quote from a villager in India that Abe Bang surveyed a few years back. Newborn babies are at God's mercy. They come with their destiny. If they have been sent for a short period, they go back. What can be done to save them? Think about, again, ubiquitous, long-standing structures that reinforce this idea for families living there. I don't blame the villager for thinking this way. I do blame other people, myself included. So danger signs of neonatal, I'm just going to survey a couple studies that describe what the determinants are in rural parts of India that suffer very high burdens of neonatal mortality. This is a study from 2006 published in the World Health Organization's bulletin, Danger Signs of Neonatal Illness. And they do is walk through, surveyed a number of families and asked them what they do when their babies are born. Again, vast majority of them born in the home. So bathing practices. The baby is bathed the same day he or she is born in both winter and summers. The rationale to remove vernix, which is considered dirty and must be removed. Newborn boys are bathed in warm water. Girls are bathed in cold water. The rationale, the belief that the girls have more heat inside and it is necessary to make their behavior calm and cool. The baby is generally given honey and water and goat's milk for the first 3 days. Perceived rationale, it is light and nutritious. Colostrum is not given. First milk of the mother is thick and indigestible. Breastfeeding is delayed until after the first 3 days. The perceived rationale is mother's milk is not produced in the body for the first few days and is only produced after a few days when the baby comes in contact with the mother. More procedures, more things, skin care procedures. This is not just unique to India. Baby is massaged daily with mustard oil. Perceived rationale, to make him or her healthy and to prevent him from drying up. Cord care, mustard oil is poured on the cord daily. The cord drops off easily. Protection from evil spirits. A sharp iron object is kept beside the newborn or an iron object is tied around the neck of a newborn. It helps ward off evil. The mother and baby are kept in a room together. It helps to ward off evil and protects the child from diseases. The baby should not be taken out in the sun for at least a week. Protects the child from evil and cold air outside. Nobody touches the mother and the baby until the mother is out of a period of isolation, which is just considered when she's polluted. Again, it helps ward off evil from the child. And a fire is lit in the entrance of these huts that Manish showed. Protects the child from a stiff jaw and blue skin. It deters evil and prevents tetanus. You can imagine how challenging it is to overcome these kinds of barriers. Unbelievably challenging. It's hard, hard, hard work. That's just some of the barriers. Let's talk about costs a little bit. A study that was just published last year, again in northern India, they followed 500 babies after they were born for 6 weeks and asked the families who actually went and sought care either in the community or at a district hospital how much it cost them. The general results were the mean monthly income of the families was about US dollars, 70 US dollars. The mean out-of-pocket expenses for a neonatal illness, if they just saw a community health worker, and this is just a private practicing non-doctor, was about $40. And if they actually took their child to be hospitalized, the mean out-of-pocket expense was $120. So these barriers are unbelievably big. I mean, again, we take for granted that some insurance, whether it's government or a private insurer, is going to pay for our kids' care from start to finish until maybe they leave, or we're going to get a bill, a few months down the line. But nobody asks Manish or me when a baby comes in, how's this baby's care going to get paid fair? That's the first thing that's asked when these families seek care. The first thing, how are you going to pay for this? So, because these barriers have been so substantial, a lot of emphasis and interest has been on changing what's happening in the community. Abe Bang and Rani Bang have done landmark work in India that has been criticized by some. We can have a separate conversation about whether that's warranted or not. Has tried to show in a way that there is a way to move forward that focuses on community-based interventions. And his approach was, look, these families are not going to go to the hospital. When they go to the hospital, they get terrible care. They're treated badly, and there's absolutely no guarantee that their child's going to be any better. So we have to do something. We have to make a compromise. And the one that makes sense is empowering the people in the community itself to try to deal with the problems. And he's spent, just like Manisha spent 7 years building up and helping to build a nursery in Uganda, they spent 20 years working with these villagers using a village health care worker model, and have dramatically dropped the rate of sepsis and deaths due to sepsis in statistically overwhelming numbers, and it's become a model for much of India and elsewhere in the world. And I just want to share with you Abe's quote, which again will sort of reveal my biases, but I think we're talking about ethics here, and I love the quote. "I shall give you a talisman." Abe his father was a good friend of Gandhi, and so Abe's informed by Gandhian philosophy, but he says this, "I shall give you a talisman. When you are in doubt, or when the self becomes too much on you, bring before your eyes the weakest, most wretched, and miserable human being that you ever saw, and ask yourself that you contemplate, about your decision, what will it reduce his misery? Will it reduce his helplessness? And you've got your answer." I'll just briefly mention this other study again. This is the movement that much of global health initiatives are going in. Tony Costello in London and others have worked also in another part of India, empowering women. And what they've done is essentially taken a model that's not different from Abe's and started in the communities, utilizing self-help groups of women living in these communities and just empowering them to think about what's causing their health care problems for themselves and for their children around the time of birth, and thinking collectively about how they might improve the situation for themselves. So again, avoiding the hospital because they're not trying to force them to go there, they're encouraging it, but they're also asking them to take ownership of this problem and think of ways to move forward. These are just some of the pictures. So I'm going to turn now, because I think that is one direction that we're clearly moving in and need to move in. But I think that there's another set of problems that is largely undiagnosed and not talked about. And I'm going to share with you, I think I gave you guys the paper, but the results, we did a study in probably one of the top 5 hospitals in India. I'm not at liberty to say which one, but an outstanding NICU. And this gets back to the idea of the background conditions and ubiquitous social structures informing practices. So if we have ethical dilemmas around the margins of viability in our hospitals in India, I'm going to share with you what the problems are in a place that provides just about every kind of care you would want in India for a baby. This is the paper, and I had the great fortune of working with a now PhD graduate, Ingrid Melchig, who Maureen's going to meet next week in Singapore. She just finished her doctoral thesis. She's an MD student who's finishing her MD right now. She's from Norway, and she did all the field work for this study. So all my gratitude goes to her. The neonatology department served a population of 600,000, treats on average 2,000 to 8,000 babies. If you're outborn, you generally pay. There's a sliding scale for people who are inborn, depending on your ability to pay. You can see that they had a level 3 unit with 15 beds and 8 ventilators, high-frequency ventilation. They have surfactant, and they did have inotropic agents, no nitric oxide. Everybody can be individually monitored in the level 3 unit, and the typical nursing ratio is 1 to 2, but more often 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. They had level 2 and a level 1 unit. The things that are notable about that is that the nurse to infant ratios are 1 to 7, 1 to 15, 1 to 10, 1 to 20 for managing asphyxia, managing sepsis, managing basic prematurity. The study was conducted over 3 months. Ingrid interviewed a number of different stakeholders, but it was all on the provider side. The lamentation we have is we were not able to interview the families, but we did spend a lot of time, she spent a lot of time working with the providers in both OB and neonatal care. And she made observations over the course of the 3 months. That's sort of typical ethnographic work. So she polled a number of the providers involved in treatment decisions for babies and asked them what their threshold for initiating treatment based on gestational age was. You can see a range of providers, and the cutoff is generally around 28 weeks, and the weight is generally around 1 kilo. This is with ventilators, with surfactant. And the thing that was striking about it is that every single one of them said that we certainly can keep alive and get babies to survive up to 25 weeks, no problem. They weren't worried about it. And they just had a much higher threshold. So that raises the question, why? If you know you can keep babies alive after 25 weeks that are 750 grams, why do you have a higher threshold? Well, here's the bottom line. In the department, we feel, these are direct quotes from the providers, in the department we feel that we should only give productive children to the family. No handicap, need of treatment, tone abnormality, retinopathy, learning disability, need to be taken care of in special ways. If you give a diseased child, a compromised child, the family is devastated. As there is no social security system for these premature, and the commitment from the family is not there in our society, we try to limit ourselves to the babies where it is likely to get better. Over the child's rights are the child's belongings. The child belongs to the family. There, the family's motivation is the main factor we put weight on. Therefore, we sometimes pay more attention to the family than the child itself. We try not to make waste for the family. It is better for them to go for a new baby. So think about those perceptions, those attitudes, and contrast that with what we think about here. Ask ourselves how much this has to do with social determinants, economic determinants, the background conditions versus what we take for granted here. So John's here, and I'm glad, because John actually provided anecdotal evidence supporting the same thing. He wrote a lovely one-page piece in HCR, Hastings Center Report, a few years back that documented his, and John, if I misquote you, please correct me, describing his experience at a grand round kind of a forum there where he talked about newborn care. This is a quote, an exchange that he had with the doctor, the chief doctor there of pediatrics, I assume. In America, quote, in America, so you sometimes force treatment on babies even when the parents don't want it, he said. That would never happen here. John replies, really? You mean that if a baby had an easily treatable condition but the parents wanted to take him home, you'd let them? Of course, he said. We don't have enough resources to treat the babies of parents who want them treated. Why would we waste them on babies whose parents don't want treatment? And then John reflects, in Delhi, death didn't seem as unexpected or as tragic as it did in America. It was everywhere, it happened, it was part of the cycle. In the face of this, I understood the uselessness of the framework we've erected to protect the best interests of the child, even against his parents. Oops. So, I'm going to end with a couple slides, and I want to ask, I'm really just going to ask questions. Dean Jamison's a wonderful, thoughtful guy that's a professor here at Washington. He's done a lot of epidemiologic economics work about the global burden of disease. He, a few years back, tried to construct an ethical argument for maybe thinking about babies differently that I think harkens back to what Annie was talking about yesterday, which I think is all worth really exploring, hopefully, in the discussion time. Created this graph to try to explain how we might think of newborns versus the rest of us, more developed beings. And this is a quote from his chapter in the book. The intuition behind the acquisition of life potential concept is that an infant or a fetus only gradually acquires the full value, the full life potential reflected in a stream of life years beginning at birth. That is, ALP can be gradual. The ethical understanding of this concept is based on two judgments. A, an individual life acquires value only as it acquires self-awareness, and B, an individual life acquires additional value as it develops bonds with others. This is the graph he constructed. As you get older, you acquire more value. And notice this is an ethical, meant to be moral argument about how we might think about how we value one another in the world. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, I think this is a descriptive reality of what we saw in India. Maybe it's a descriptive reality of what we think about for the most extreme premature babies here or fetuses. That's different than saying it ought to be how we think about the world. I don't know. I think that's a genuine question. I think Annie's showing you some interesting data here to suggest that about our own sense at the margins of viability. My concern, again, wearing Paul's hat, is that if we say this is okay, this is how we ought to construct the world, are we reinforcing, particularly in places like India or Africa, where newborn life is so easily, death is so easily prevented, reinforcing a normative idea that ultimately takes us a few steps back rather than a few steps forward. You know, we talked about double standards in research or standards of care. This is a double standard if we set it up that it's okay for babies in India to be treated one way, we can value them less. But those same babies in our country, oh no, we're going to treat them very differently because we value them differently. It's a hard question. And just to remind you what the background here is, since I do wear a law hat as well. I have 1 minute, right? Chief Justice Berger, in a very famous case in the United States, said this: the law's concept of the family rests on the presumption that parents possess what a child lacks in maturity, experience, and capacity for judgment required for making life's difficult decisions. More importantly, historically, it has recognized that the natural bonds of affection lead parents to act in the best interests of their child. As with so many legal presumptions, experience and reality may rebut what the law accepts as a starting point. So we've done a lot of legal bashing these past few days, or last day and a half. I want to argue that it's critical that this kind of thing exists because it pushes our normative ideas forward. It reinforces ideas that we now take as bedrock in this country without legal apparatuses, without expressions of collective society will. We would move back. We wouldn't have protections in place. And it's a gap. It's a big gap in the rest of the world. I'm going to skip the CAPTA stuff, but I think that's the same idea. I'll just end with this question for all of you. Whose values what values? So is there something like common morality? We use a word like justice. Is it across all individuals? Does justice end at our doorstep, at our community step, our society step? When does it begin to cross political boundaries? Why is it that we're having a conversation about this now? Why does it seem to bother so many of us in the room? And yet, why are we not prepared to ask hard questions about the social and societal things that help perpetuate injustice? I think that's where you need to go if you want to really get at this. The last thing is this idea of moral relativism and moral or objectivity. Can we just sit here and say, well, the circumstances in India or Africa are such that it's okay for the physicians there, it's justifiable for them to make the kinds of decisions they do under the circumstances, and that's the end of it. So we have to tolerate a little bit of moral relativism in the world. Or are we going to say that there's something like an objective idea of justice? Is it the case that if a baby who has no say on where they're born, has dumb luck to be born here versus there, gets to be treated differently because they're born here versus there? I'll end there. Thank you.